Hello, welcome. Take a seat. Oh, let me take that shrapnel out of your glass. If you want to eat, we have two-headed duck, barely radioactive. If your hands still function, I leave you with a menu while I bring you a drink that is hardly contaminated at all. Oh, excuse me. I forget to say. Welcome to the guild. You know, there's nothing better than lying on a sun lounger, looking out across the ocean and seeing head after head just roll onto the beach. It's much more exciting than it was back in the old days.
Yeah, it is much more exciting, especially now that you've let me out of the boot of the car. It was very nice of you to bring me from the compound down to the beach, but I didn't realize that you planned on packing the back full of all those heads so that we could bob them on the waves.
Well, I mean, firstly, I had to make sure we weren't being followed, because you know you're not allowed out of the compound. Not after the last time.
Well, I think we'd all agree that it's best that I remain in after the last time.
Well, exactly. And secondly, you know, there's nothing better than a head bob. You know, has there been a greater, more beautiful sight than to see happy, smiling children emerging, salt-stained from the waves, clasping a severed human head in their hands and throwing it between each other? It's the most beautiful thing you could ever see.
It truly is, and it really makes me wonder, whether historical ethnographers will look back and see, the origins of the game of what we used to call soccer, and I guess what you used to call football, in this head-bobbing sport. You know, once you get far enough away, I think they might see the origins as reversed, because clearly the head-bobbing game is the superior one.
Well, and they do say, that history repeats itself. So it might just be a circle of, decapitation leads to physical excellence, leads to the codification of rules, leads to a sport, leads to that sport causing the apocalypse, leading to decapitation, and so on, ad infinitum until the sun explodes.
That cosmology sounds absolutely right to me.
Well, I mean, it seems as plausible as all the other ones.
Somewhat more than some.
So, anyway, you're familiar with my dalliances around the compound on my Segway.
I am, but I thought we were here to talk about board games.
Well, indeed. But no, so I've been going around the beach because I've noticed, and you won't have noticed because, I'm not going to lie to you, I got quite an electric thrill hearing you every sort of 4 or 5 hours banging on the boot of the car and screaming, "Let me out before I die." It's just, it's another one of the great entertainments this world offers. But I've been going around some of the patrons at the bars, drinking their thallium cocktails, and I've been asking them, things about the board game world. And this time it was think back to those days before the world was one endless fatal game of kill a person. And, are games getting easier, I asked them, and is that a problem? And have you seen a trend? I think back to games like Notre Dame, to the early 2000s, where the game systems were punishing, and you had to not just maximise your engine, but make sure that you could fight against what the game would throw at you. Have you seen a trend towards games being more forgiving, allowing players to get more?
So, but I want to caveat this, and that's always a great way to start a conversation, is a whole bunch of caveats.
Absolutely. But never commit to anything.
Well, I'd like to leave as many degrees of freedom available so that when you corner me, I'll have a way out. I have heard that it is very important to leave a way out for when Ben Maddox corners you.
You're not the first to say it, you won't be the last.
No, I found that in designing games, we get a lot of advice that goes down this road of be careful about railroading the players on the one hand, but also make sure that you don't alienate them right away or give them a lot of negative feedback in the form of a very difficult or punishing or unforgiving game. And so we've trimmed out a lot of the game systems where if you make a mistake on turn 1, it will fatally wound you for turn 10. And I think largely that has served the needs and the tastes of the majority of gamers. But the reason I caveat all this is because in 1995 there were maybe 80 games a year published that made it to gamers here in the States, and by pre-apocalypse 2019 that number was at 4,000. So there's more of everything. There's simply every kind of gaming fetish you might have could be satisfied. So it's hard to talk about our games becoming more, and I think it's maybe easier to talk about, is our conversation or is the center of our gravity changed? And I think it certainly has.
I think it's very interesting in that... So, I mean, what promoted me to ask this question was that I played Kahless for the first time. And what struck me about Kahless is Kahless felt like a game in which you had to carefully chart your way through the game, otherwise it would kick you. And I have seen, when you see the development of worker placement ever since, they all seem to be a response to Kahless or to Agricola. Ways to fix those games, to make it less punishing, to make it easier to navigate. So having multiple spaces at a location, having those kind of meeples that even if the space is full you can still place it there and do that. And it seems its quintessence is in Charterstone, in which I've never played a game that is more forgiving, that allows you to do something every time you place a figure, and really acts like a Skinner box with all of those negative connotations appending to that. I really felt like a sort of a pigeon just hitting a button and getting seed and fundamentally being bored of seed, right?
I think you're absolutely right in characterizing Charterstone that way, and more broadly the Stonemaier games oeuvre, right? That is the most important design sensibility that unites Stonemaier games, is that they're strongly distanced from negative player interactions, even as they take on the forms of games that are typically much tighter and much more punishing. So, Scythe is probably the best example, right? Scythe is pitched as, Agricola meets Kemet, a very challenging Euro resource management game meets a very aggressive territory control and combat game. That was the pitch. But the reality of Scythe is you never use your mech to attack undefended people, because you'd lose way too much popularity, and that's what really scores you points. There's something psychologically vulnerable to me about the design of Scythe, in that I feel like we peer into Jamie's soul a little bit, and the desire to create and produce and be popular and loved is so in the bones of that game that it really makes me look at the designer and say, is that what being good feels like to you? Right, as opposed to mastery or dominance or control, it's everyone felt good and I'm the most popular.
And I mean, do you see this? Because I mean, I think fundamentally, I'm playing through Charterstone again at the moment, so it's very.
Everyone makes bad life choices, Ben.
Right, indeed, and my God, but it just seems to me that there has been a call amongst especially certain people in the media for games to be more forgiving, to give me something now, I want it now. Whereas, worker placement games used to have the two distinct phases. You placed the workers, everyone placed the workers, then you had the resolution phase. There was an element of planning, whereas now they seem far more tactical. Do you think there's been a shift over to tactical rather than strategic, because what tactical offers you is something right now, not later?
So I think that there are other design goals that end up leading to this place rather than that this place is necessarily set as the goal. So one of the things that is for sure, an incontrovertible trend is the declining playtime of games. So a middleweight Euro in 2000 was a 2-hour game. Maybe 90 minutes to 2 hours, but 2-hour game. And certainly Agricola is at that length, if not longer. But as we go forward, one of the solutions that designers were trying to come up with is how to achieve a similar experience in a smaller amount of time, primarily by cutting in two areas. Number one is cutting the distance between action and resolution time. So in Kahless, we'd all place our workers, then we'd engage in this resolution phase where we'd receive our rewards. And that went away very, very quickly. And we went to the immediate reward that feeds your Skinner box sensibility, right? I place a thing, I get a reward. But it's much quicker. And so we gained a lot of time back by shifting to that style of resolution. And the second thing that designers tried to do was cut down on downtime, right? Cut down on that analysis paralysis, the amount of time that it takes to make a decision. And they did that in two different ways. One way was by making the gaps between the decisions much, much smaller, such that all the decisions, it's a lot more about which direction do you want to take, which story do you want to tell. Caverna versus Agricola. Caverna is much more about, which part of this game do you find entertaining, rather than which part of this game do you think is going to win it for you, because it's just so hard to see through. The equation is so opaque and the differences in values are so small that you just sort of shrug and say, I like playing with dwarves in caves, so I'm going to do the cave stuff. That was one way. The other way was the opposite, which was to make it so much more obvious which of these choices was best, so that you wouldn't spend a lot of time cogitating. You would just know, which choice was better, and you really engaged in kind of a draft of, okay, these are all the round 1 picks. If they're all gone, I know this next set of buildings is the round 2 picks. Both of those lead us to the same place, right? Which is the games feel less difficult to parse, and therefore give us less of a feeling of achievement or mastery, and feel less difficult.
I mean, what's interesting though is, I kind of agree with you, but when I look at sort of this recent, and I'd say Nussfjord aside, this recent sort of spate of games from Uwe Rosenberg, people have described them, I think specifically of Caverna, Fields of Arla, and Feast for Odin, and people have been saying, they're more open world, and they don't, that is true, I think, by their very nature, but what it says to me, it doesn't say to me, open world, I have all of these choices. What it says to me is underdeveloped, unfinished, because I remember when I first started playing games, and, the games I would play when I was 16, 17, smoking weed with friends, and we just had to kill 2 hours. I remember we played Game of Life quite a bit, and these sort of roll and move games are very easy to play, in the sense that all decisions are made after you roll the dice. So the first thing you do is roll the dice. But I remember playing Trajan and setting the board out before the people arrived and thinking, there's no sort of instigating action here. I have these choices, and what do I do? And what Stefan Feld did that was very clever in Trajan is he gives you a card which has a goal, which sort of gives you an initial impetus. It allows you to step into the world of the game first. And what that said to me was, this is about development and craft. This is giving you a sort of narrow path of decisions that once you've overcome them, the decision tree broadens and widens, and then you can truly inhabit the world of the game. But you need that path into the game before the game wakes up and you're able to fully live in that world. And what I've seen with something like Caverna, like Feast for Odin, is that final step of development has just seemingly been ignored, and here's the whole world of the game, you just decide where to jump in. And it strikes me as underdeveloped rather than more forgiving, right?
Yeah, I think that again, I disagree that the choice to leave that game in that open world state is an act of under development. I think it is a valid artistic choice that feeds a particular audience's wants, and in that sense, it's. I mean, I don't know. You want to call it, it's a model kit instead of a finished product. I mean, that's okay. I'm willing to accept the notion that players playing a game like Feast for Odin are participating partially in the design process through their play.
Right, but when I read a novel, I want to read the final draft. I don't want to read the third draft. I don't want to read the unresolved plot. I don't want to read the bad syntax. I want.
Right, but that's because you want to read a novel, and some people want to choose your own adventure game, but they don't want to be told that what they bought was choose your own adventure. Right? Like there's product and packaging issues that get in the way of the analysis here, because fundamentally there's a bunch of consumers, players of games, who really like this style of activity, and we can twist ourselves into knots saying, is it a game? Is it the right kind of game? Is this what games should be, etc.? And it's not going to change very much about whether games are made in that style, because their popularity is undeniable. So I'm more interested...
But nevertheless, I mean, my job in what I do is to identify why I think this is a flawed idea, and your job in what you do is to decide whether you think that's a viable way for you to go forward in your work. I mean, when you approach games like this, do you see them as, you've said a valid artistic choice. I'm not entirely sure I agree, but do they feel underdeveloped to you, or do they feel like a new style, a new iteration of game?
To me, they certainly feel like a new style and iteration rather than being underdeveloped, in part because the complexity of the interactions and all the little machines that you can put together in those games is high, but they don't break. So it tells me that a lot of work has been done to ensure that, and that's work that we would typically call development. What I want to suggest is that we need a different aesthetic by which to evaluate these games, and that ultimately we're being defeated by having to lump all of these kinds of things under the category game without any further distinction. Now, we faced this challenge earlier in the 90s when we decided that the games coming in that had this player agency and low randomness and were coming largely out of Europe should be called Euro games, and should be evaluated on a different aesthetic than the American games, or the Ameritrash games as they were commonly called then. I think we need to continue pushing forward on that, and that it's not reasonable to me to think that we can find a unifying aesthetic for, Rising Sun on the one hand, a clear hybrid Euro-American game, a pinnacle of that hybridization, versus a Feast for Odin, which I see as a sort of, maybe a degeneration a little bit of that Euro aesthetic, but nevertheless, its own take on the Euro aesthetic, where you're going to have lots of choices and very little conflict, and the opacity of the equation is what is honored. Everyone wants to feel like you're not really too sure what's going to be great, but there's lots of toys to play with.
But is this not saying that we need to find a new aesthetic, a new lexicon, essentially? Saying that we are just shifting the goalposts based on what we assume a game to be? Because this is interesting, because you do have people who are primarily into fantasy, you have people who are primarily into science fiction or whatever, but you also have, if I look at book reviewers, they're people who review anything of a certain type within certain limits, but across the board, and they don't say, Or I consider it a cop-out for them to say, oh, this is good for a sci-fi book, or this is good for a fantasy novel. There should be an ideal of talking about these things, where you're able to say, no, this is a good game. Now, it has these aspects which contribute to the way the game makes you feel, or the way it deals with chance, but fundamentally, it lives or dies by a standard that we hold to games, not just subgenres of games.
Well, I do feel like better clarification about what we mean by game genres would be helpful, and I think that your point about critique is maybe a little misstated in that genre plays an incredibly important part in critique, and if you're, for example, critiquing a horror novel, you do in fact look for the particulars that you are looking for in horror. So if you have a horror novel that doesn't leave you feeling eerie or afraid or emotionally terrorized in some way, you would agree that that horror novel has failed, even if as a novel it may do many wonderful things, it fails its genre, which is essentially a way of saying there are some good ways for an artist to achieve their purpose, and genres are a way of cataloging some of those, and we reflect those back on one another and feed them back on one another. So it turns out that the bones of the Euro game, that worker placement style decision, is a really good tool for a lot of different kinds of expressions. And we were just used to seeing one kind. We were used to seeing designers using it for an expression of a very tight and highly competitive, mastery-based interaction, but it turns out it's really useful for a different style. And that's what we're seeing. And I don't know if it's clear from our conversation that I don't care for any of those games, and I find the sort of open world, sandbox, victory point salad Euro to be among my least favorite of genres, precisely because I like the bite, right? But I feel like, particularly in a post-apocalyptic world, admitting that you like the bite is maybe a dangerous thing to say. But fortunately...
Well, I mean, it depends where you're being bitten, of course.
That's always been true, Ben. No, what I'm pleased about is that we are also seeing the further refinement and evolution of those punishing mechanisms. So if you want to play Food Chain Magnate, you'll experience a wonderful economic game that, to my mind, makes it... There's no reason to play, Age of Steam when you can play Food Chain Magnate, right? Not that, without judging anyone who likes those games or whatever, but to the point that it is an even cleaner and better and more interesting, to my mind, distillation of those economic mechanisms. And so that game exists for you. So I don't mind that there's what I see as kind of an overgrown and undertended garden of Skinner box Euros. And that is a disparaging term. But I don't care for those games.
Yeah, I think fair enough as well, and I think to assert your likes and dislikes and to retrofit big words onto them is kind of what we do in our everyday life anyway. But I mean, as a designer, do you consider it part of your job to guide your players into the world of your game? Or is it enough for you to lay the game out there and say, just fiddle around with levers until you pull something that works?
My approach to design is still commercially focused, in that I am not sitting in my workshop and trying to express the deepest feelings of my heart in the medium of board game. I am not, a recluse who is walking in the garden paths and waiting for the muse to inspire me so that, I may be the channel through which divinity flows, or any of that sort of, those ideas about art and where it comes from and what belongs in games. That's not who I am. There are folks out there who are doing amazing things with that approach. It's just not me. I am trying to produce games that people will play and enjoy, that are competitive. I think at the heart of my game design is the desire to puzzle solve. Almost all my games have some element of there's a puzzle you've got to solve, and that's a hallmark of my design approach. And by nature, that means that my games are going to have some challenge to them because they don't have the obvious choice, and they're always looking to put you on the horns of a dilemma. That's something that I need to now modulate or package or fit into a product aesthetic, right? Into what does the market desire, into what are publishers looking to publish, and into what kinds of experiences are gamers saying they want to have. And even gamers who seek challenging and complex games are also seeking scaffolding, are seeking basic guidance. You know, when you talked about the card that you get in Trajan, that's a masterstroke by Feld because it's one element that provides tremendous illumination for the gamer when they sit down even to their very first game. So I do spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about whether gamers will have enough information to make what feel like good choices when playing games that I design.
Well, I was speaking to Elusive 2, and it's very, especially when it comes to cleaning the toilet duty, they're especially elusive. And they were saying to me that, first of all, they'd express it as games getting less tense and interactive rather than getting easier. And the thing with tension and interaction is that they produce bad emotional states in people. Some people handle that, but many don't for various reasons. And since board gaming requires people to sit down together around a shared table, this is a problem. Thus, if you produce a game that is sufficiently interesting, even without tension and interaction for the people who want to compete, you'll even get their friends in there. And so, do you think that that's right, that... I mean, I guess it's a broader question. Do you think we live in a particularly febrile age at the moment, and we naturally incline ourselves towards games that don't wish us to feel ill towards those across the table? Whereas maybe in the 2000s, before, where it felt less like the world was falling to bits, we were sort of more amenable to stealing someone else's milkshake.
I think we live in an incredibly tentative era. And the possible consequences of offending someone or putting someone in an uncomfortable situation are both more visible to us, but also feel higher to us. And this isn't, we're speaking in very broad strokes, but I do feel like the audience for gaming has expanded sufficiently that some of those closer ties that you develop within any subculture are not as close and not as you can't expect that they exist as much. So it is true that when I sat down to a board game in the late 90s, I anticipated a fierce competition. That's what most of the games were about. And that's just what we expected going in. And not only that, I knew, just based on the kinds of people who largely participated in the hobby at that time, that I would get some smirks by the player who was ahead or pulled off something particularly clever, and I would get maybe some poor sportsmanship, and I would get some socially awkward responses and conduct. And I was okay with that, right? I bought in. We talk less and less about, that conventions smell bad because they don't smell so bad anymore. But that used to be one of those things that you'd have to expect in the community of gamers. And all of that has changed. And with that has changed your expectation that a game is going to involve getting beat up a bit or beating on others a bit. That's not so bad, though. So I'll tell you a story. One of my close friends, we loved playing board games together, but he really didn't play board games except with me. And our tastes ran to the two-player troops on a map style games. So we played a lot of War of the Ring. We also played a lot of Twilight Struggle, right? We played these highly combative direct conflict games. And, I would win nearly all of them, simply because I play a lot more games than he does. And at a certain point, he said to me, I'm just tired of getting beaten up all the time. I love these games. They're super fun, but I'm just emotionally not ready to be beaten up again. And so I showed him Terraforming Mars. And even though that is a competitive game and there's a winner and a loser and there's some, a little bit of take that in there, fundamentally, Terraforming Mars is about building up, not about tearing down. And the cleverness is in your engine building, not in your war making. And there, all of a sudden, was a much more positive social experience for both of us that still satisfied the board game desires that we had.
You see, my worry is, I think by and large, people not being weird and confrontational around a table is a good thing. Don't get me wrong here. But what I love in games, and I don't think I'm alone in this, what I love in games is the potential for failure, is the worry that it might not get round to me, the constriction that I might not be able to do what I want, and the best of all possible things, which is being confronted with two fabulous decisions and having to only take one. What I don't want is blancmange. What I don't want is mashed potato without salt in it. Just because people want to be nicer to each other doesn't mean that the game systems should be universally forgiving, that you should be able to poke your finger through them, that you should get everything you want at all time, because fundamentally that's unsatisfying.
Well, I think that you and I are in the same boat in terms of our desires, and I think that there's plenty of games still out there to feed them. I am concerned about the overall culture of gaming and to what extent are we losing the expectations and the sort of the necessary social context for conflict games and difficult games to still be okay. I am a little bit concerned about that. However, what I understand from the flood of gamers entering the market is that they just don't share those same desires for games in the same way. And Wingspan to me is the perfect example. Wingspan is a really well-designed game in terms of the smoothness of its engine and its accessibility and its product design and its loveliness, and it does a lot of things right, but it's not competitive. It just doesn't admit much room for competitive mastery, and it has certain random elements that are incredibly decisive, although they're well concealed, right? So it's not, I roll a die, I win. It's, you didn't know this, but I drew 3 very valuable bird cards, and I'm going to slowly play them out and win, and neither you nor I may notice the random moment at which I won, but it was random. And so people, I think we're seeing a bifurcation, right? There's people who love the game and think it's wonderful and enjoy essentially the tea time game, right? We're gonna sit around and chat and have our tea and play our birds, and at the end we'll count them up and somebody will win. And then there's a bunch of people saying, I don't get all the hype. This is it's a gewgaw, right? It's a lovely design, it's nice to look at, but there's not game here. There's something else that it's your favorite new cereal, now it tastes like a game.
Yeah, well, Steven Syrek, I bumped into him on the beach the other day, and quite frankly, he doesn't take well to this lack of ozone layer. Peeling was not the word I would use, more like flesh exposed, but he said it may be that feeds into this. It may be that games have crossed some threshold into light entertainment, so that punishing games don't make sense of people who never play them more than a few times. And I guess when you talk about a bifurcation, I am one of the few people who plays board games sort of regularly that detests comic books and this sort of complete dilution of our culture, with every blockbuster movie being a bloody reiteration of these proto-fascist comic book heroes. But enough about that. But do you see that you'll have, in the way music when I look back at sort of the 60s and things, you had sort of people who were into the Beatles, but they were also into sort of more underground stuff, and it was such a nascent art form that it hadn't formed into tribes yet, which is what is inevitable when things become more established. Do you think this bifurcation being a trifurcation, quadrication, and so you will have many more tribes and people who don't cross over the border into the mainstream and just say, no, this is not for me, and pride themselves on rubbing their beards and saying, oh no, this game that was constructed in a shed using dog shit is the only game I will play, or does that already exist?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, to me, it's sort of like the anthem "Punk is dead," right? Punk has been dead for longer than punk has been alive, and punk continues to outlive its death. In that there's always that countercultural sentiment, and there's always somebody in a garage rejecting what comes today. You know, I sometimes think about it as the "Do you know the way to San Jose" effect. So it's a song that came out in 1968, sung by Dionne Warwick. So you know, it was a real big hit. But it also became a little bit of an anthem of rejection because there were so many incredible things happening in 1968 in music that was so far from, you know, this sort of saccharine track, "Do You Know the Way to San Jose?" And the irony in 2019 is that lots of folks still know that track, "Do You Know the Way to San Jose?" Its popularity endured, as did many of those things that were so countercultural to it, but we've sort of flopped them on our heads.
What's so interesting about that? Then I put this to you, and it's a question that is often posed. Firstly, does popularity equate to quality? And secondly, does lifespan equate to quality? Because something has been around and people still remember it. Does that mean it's good, or can it still be shit?
Yeah, so I'm largely not a positivist in the sense that just because something lasted a long time, to my mind, doesn't mean it's good, but I'm also an artistic relativist, which is to say that what good means in 2019 is not universal to every other time and era, because I fundamentally believe that art is a conversation, and language evolves, and what makes great art is its ability to exist within its context, right? To be conversational, in a sense.
But sort of a non-contextual art that can be removed from its contemporary context and span the centuries. And I think of Shakespeare and I think of Sophocles and things like this. Surely that is the stuff that is fundamental, that speaks to us as what we are as animals. And something lasting 50 years is as ephemeral as something lasting a week.
That's no doubt true, but let's think about this. If you had to pick the 10 best songs of the 1960s, it would be hard, right? You would leave a lot of songs out.
Well, number one is obviously "Do You Know the Way to San Jose?"
Well, clearly top of the list, but you know, there's so many songs that are incredible.
I don't, by the way.
You don't feel like it would be difficult to do that?
No, I don't know the way to San Jose.
I'm fairly sure the girl from Ipanema knows the way.
She does. It's a long way from Brazil, though. It's a long way from Brazil.
Well, we'll stick a message in a head and bob it along, and wait until it returns. I think that's the way that we have a social network nowadays.
I'm trying to work on sort of animatronic things with speakers, so the heads can bob up onto the beach, and then they can speak to you. Hello, my name's Dead John. Ben says, can I borrow 20 quid?
Yeah, we could call it, especially if we only used the heads of men, we could call that voicemail.
That's amazing. I'm giving up this podcast now. You've ruined it by making the best joke that's ever going to have been made on this show. Damn you, Shalev.
It's been a real honor, thank you. Well, no, but getting back to the point is there are hundreds or thousands of songs that were all amazing, and 5 of them at best will survive 200 years. So to some extent, what survives is an accident, not a mark of quality. But
and
you
I
do
guess
need
that's
to
chauvinism of the present time, right, as well.
Yes, and chauvinism of Western culture, which has this sort of glorification of the individual, such that we hold up Shakespeare, whereas in other cultures we hold up the notion of storytelling, and not the individual storyteller.
But the Bhagavad Gita has survived, and Gilgamesh has survived. These things are still, and these things are still here, and I think they reinforce my point rather than.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think that most of us read the Bible and go, why is this considered good? Right?
Well, they could do with an editor.
It could do with, and the irony, of course, is that it had many editors over hundreds of years, and this is still the best that we got out of it.
I mean, if we want to go off on a slight sidebar here, it's because the problem with divine literature is it's sort of inviolable, although I know people do fuck around with it an awful lot, but there's this notion that you can't. And what's so wonderful about secular art is that it doesn't have the divine, it doesn't have the thunderbolts connected to it. So you can mess around with it, you can change it, you can put on a production of Hamlet and cut half of the extraneous nonsense in it, and this is the fundamental issue with religious texts. If you were to be able to uncouple them from their divinity, then you might be able to extract the few lovely diamonds of really valuable knowledge and cut away all of the murderous shit that goes along with it, right?
Right, and I think that there's a lot of projects, both artistic and religious, that seek to do exactly that. My humorous point was only that in the time of its editing, right, the Bible went through many, many editors and many reshapings, but along a different set of aesthetic guidelines and for a different set of ultimate purposes than we have today. And that's why we read it today and it needs explication. I feel the same way about the Mona Lisa. I did not understand for a very long time what was so great about this portrait. It's a portrait. It seems lovely. I get it. She's half smiling. Why is this so incredible? And I have read books trying to explain what is so transcendent and interesting and compelling and different about the Mona Lisa, and the best I can say is it's important for us to know that conversation, but the Mona Lisa was much more impactful in the time that it was painted than it could possibly be today. And so that's where I land with art and with games, that you have to first think about them within their living cultural context. And a handful will transcend, and that's fine, but you can't shoot for that, and I don't know how much you can even learn from that.
Well, I don't think an artist in any stripe, and we can get on to debate whether board game designers are artists or not.
They are. There's no conversation.
But, well, excellent. So that makes the podcast slightly pointless. I was speaking to Grimbo Graham Hall, and he makes a point which sort of, I think he's a slightly different gamer from us, and he said more recent games offer many viable options, so the decision is often which option is best, and he gives Feast for Odin as an example. This feels less punishing and more fun to me. I do notice that I generally do worse at these games, as the compunction to stick to a strategy is no longer there, and I get distracted by the shiny option rather than the strategic one. And I guess this comes back to what we've been talking about, but it's an interesting sort of different view on it in that it almost implies that whereas the previous goal of games was to do best, was to optimize, this is a sandbox. It's a stroll through a forest with a vague notion of when you're going to get back to the car, but it doesn't really matter which path you take, and it doesn't really matter how long it takes or how much exercise you get. It's just, without wanting to use the tritest of trite phrases, but nevertheless I'm going to because I'm not very original, the journey being the goal, not the destination. Is that what he's saying? And is that valid? And is that a reflection of these bigger open-worldier games?
Yeah, I think I like the model of kind of the Sunday drive versus the road trip. Right? The Sunday drive is about entertaining yourself with the delights available through the car window, whereas the road trip is about getting somewhere within certain limits of time and budget, without, though, eliminating the joy of the experience along the way. I think that those are kind of two good models for thinking about what a game is trying to achieve. Graham, and I want to be clear about this, it's pronounced Graham. I've learned how H-A-M is pronounced by the British, and it is not Graham. So just to be clear, it's Graham.
It's a silent H, but let's be clear now. It is not a unit of measurement, it's a name. It's Graham, not Graham.
It's certainly not a gram, no. No, that's ridiculous, and overpriced. The point that he's making is that this is the kind of game that he's going to pull off the shelf.
Right.
I, as a designer, I've got to hear that. Because I want my game to get pulled off the shelf. Now, at some point, you reach a breaking point between what you're trying to achieve in making a game and what a player wants in playing it. And those breaking points usually are what we call genre. So if I am trying to design a thinky, tight economic game, and you want to play guess whether it's your turn or my turn, which of us has the higher number card, those are two very different genres.
Right.
And I can't listen to you and have that inform my Eurogame design. So, is there an audience for my art? And if there isn't, am I still making it? For me, that answer is no.
And so, do you think there's room for the designer that designs solely for their own satisfaction?
Yeah, there's plenty of room for it, and I have some games that I am continuing to work on, even though they don't line up with current aesthetics, because I think they're cool, and I am in it for the long run, and I've seen the fashions change. So I'm sort of not that concerned. I think that those games will come back and they'll eventually find a home, but in the meantime, I'm enjoying it. However, that is not what makes up the workday of a working designer. And I have the flexibility to not be a working designer all the time, right? I have a different job and I don't rely on game design income to feed my family, so I have that luxury. However, the market continues to professionalize, and I think you and I have lamented about this before, and more designers who are working designers are, they start having that white whale game that they want to make, but they don't have time to make or they can't make because it's not commercial.
And so, essentially, does professionalism imply hackery?
I think that I think that the two are interrelated. I think that one is sort of the degenerate expression of the other.
Anyway,
Right.
when it's talking about degeneration, I've just seen the zombie version of Ursula Andress come out of the sea, and the bikini is not looking so good. And if you listen to the siren, they're calling us back in so the danger can be removed. So, if you'd like to come with me, I'll show you where you're sleeping tonight. It may seem a little car booty, but it's just a boutique aesthetic.
Well, I look forward to spending another night in the boot of the car, but only on the one condition, Ben, which is that you leave me alone this time.
That's simply not possible. Thank you for coming, and if you want to come to the guild again, firstly, shake off that glowing sand before you enter. Then go to Board Game Geek Guild 3209. And now, could I tempt you to a strontium sunrise?